Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6602, History of Architecture and Culture 6. We are in the last leg of Unit 1. We are critiquing modernism in this unit, and this is lecture number 4. If you remember the previous lecture, we saw Christopher Alexander and Robert Venturi and the writings that these 2 gentlemen made that changed the world of postmodernism. Today we are going to look at 2 interesting people too. One is Aldo Rossi and the other one is Jane Jacobs. Straight away we will move into Aldo Rossi because we have a lot of ground to cover. Aldo Rossi is an Italian architect and designer. He accomplished unusual feat of achieving international level of recognition in 4 different areas: theory, drawing, architecture and product design. He has secured international level awards and prizes and recognition in all these 4 areas. He was awarded the Pritzker Prize for Architecture in 1990, which is the highest award in architecture ever. The Pritzker juror and an architecture critic, Ada Louis Huxtable, called him as a poet who happens to be an architect. He graduated from the Polytechnic University of Milan in 1959, and while he was studying at the university, he started writing, and by 1959 he had become the editor of an architectural magazine back then, which is called the Casabella Continua. He served this post until 1964. Even though Rossi had started his professional career as an architect in 1956, but in 1963 he deviated to teaching profession and served as an architecture professor at different institutes, including the School of Urban Planning in Arezzo, the Institute of Architecture Venice, Polytechnic University of Milan. In 1965 his first book was published. It was called The Architecture of the City. It turned out to be a highbrow of architecture literature at that point of time. It was 1971 when his architectural career took a big turn and it started moving towards a little more mature phase. He owes this to an auto accident which made him end up in a hospital. It was during the stay at hospital that he came up with the inspiration for the competition project that he was taking part in those days, to build the cemetery of San Cataldo in Modena, Italy. This design that you see on the screen is the design that he made for the cemetery. The entire campus is still unfinished. Aldo Rossi's unfinished Cataldo cemetery is considered one of the first and foremost important postmodern buildings in the world. Rossi never actually said he was postmodern. He said that he cannot be a postmodern as he has never been modern in the first place. Yet his cemetery for Modena displays strong coloring, bold form, historically referential detailing that became highly synonymous with what postmodernists were doing at that particular point of time. So he was considered as postmodern by a lot of writers, including Christopher Alexander, whom we studied about in the previous episode. Actually in 1971 Rossi had his eyes set on another interesting important project which was going on, which is called the Centre Georges Pompidou. That project was eventually backed by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, but he could not participate in that particular project because of a serious auto accident just weeks before the deadline, and Rossi had to be hospitalized. It was during that hospitalization period he worked for this Modena project. These are certain visuals from the Modena project. Look at the use of raw material, look at the use of bright color, his appropriation of elements from preceding architectural styles with the adaptation of the muted blue and terracotta color palette which he had tried to use in this particular project is distinctly postmodern in approach. Even though he denies that he is a postmodern architect, every other person in the world considers him as a postmodern architect because it so synonymously congregates with the other buildings of the same era. Another visual from the project. His earliest works of the 1960s were mostly theoretical, and it displays the simultaneous influence of Italian modernism of Taragni, classicist influence of Viennese architect Adolf Loos, and the reflection of the painter Giorgio de Chirico. If you see his paintings, you can see the influence of Giorgio de Chirico, and if you look at this particular building, in the previous semester, if you rack your memories to remember, Adolf Loos designed a very similar project, similar building, which looked very similar to this building that you see here. So the inspiration for this building had come from Adolf Loos, but Adolf Loos never used this kind of a color or so much of expression in his buildings. His buildings was usually flat. Aldo Rossi was famous for his writing. In his writings, he openly criticized the lack of understanding of the city's principles in current architectural practice. He said that a city must be studied and it must be important to be studied as something that is constructed over time. The time component is being missed by most architects. It is the urban artifacts that withstand the passage of time. He went on to say that a city as such has a past, our collective memory of the people who live in the city, and that we use that memory through monuments, which he extends his version to say that monuments give structure to the city. He talks about emotional connective structures and not physical structures here. He became extremely influential in the late part of 1970s because he wrote two important books. One is Architecture of the City and the other one is a scientific autobiography. The largest of Aldo Rossi's projects in terms of the size and scale was the cemetery building in Modena, Italy. It was started in 1971 but it is yet to be completed. Rossi called it the City of the Dead. This is some of the sketches that Rossi had made. These are some of the buildings that he had designed. Let's move on to the next important architect of the day, Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was born as Jane Butzner in 1916, was an American-Canadian journalist, author and an activist who is best known for her influence on urban studies. Her very influential book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, argued that urban renewal did not respect the needs of most city dwellers. Through her writings, she introduced the sociological concepts of eyes on the street, social capital, etc. Jane Jacobs was well known for organizing grassroots efforts to protect existing neighborhoods from slum clearance, and particularly her opposition to Robert Moses in his plans to overhaul her neighborhood, which is the Greenwich Village. She was instrumental in eventual cancellation of the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have passed directly through the Soho and Little Italy, and was arrested in 1968 for inciting a crowd at a public hearing on the project. So she was an activist of sorts. She stopped a few developmental projects which would have been detrimental in value to a portion of the city. So she was even arrested for that. Some of the famous books that she had written is on the screen here. The Death and Life of Great American Cities is one of the most important books that she had written. The Economy of Cities talks about how the city works as an economy and how money comes in and moves out of the city. The Question of Separatism, Quebec and the Struggle over Sovereignty, Cities and the Wealth of Nations, Systems of Survival, The Nature of Economies, Dark Age Ahead. Today in this lecture we don't have time to deal with all the 7 or 8 books that she had written, but then we will look at in detail one of the books that she had written and the most influential one, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. This is a book that she released in 1961, and let's see what it has in us for it. She asks in this book, what makes cities work? Why are some neighborhoods full of things to do and see while others totally dull? Why does the crime rate soar in public housing developments, and why are some of our older neighborhoods so much more safe, stable and congenial? Why do some neighborhoods attract interested and responsible populations while others attract degenerate population? Why are some good neighborhoods considered as slums and by orthodox city planners? What alternatives are there to current city planning and rebuilding? She looks at all these 6-7 questions and then she tries to answer all these things on her own in her book. The purpose of the book was a clear attack on the current methods of city planning by all these famous so-called city planners, according to her. She explains the new principles that needs to be considered during city planning. She proposes an argument for different methods from those now in use. She proposes an alternative to conventional city planning. Conventional city planners, which result in decline of cities, the reasons cited by them: blighted by too many people, mixture of commercial, industrial and residential uses, old buildings and narrow streets, some landlords or landowners who stand in the way of large scale development. These are the problems that are cited by conventional city planners. If you look at these problems, the results are threefold: that they breed apathy and crime, they discourage investment in a particular city, they contaminate areas around them. So, for example, if you have a city which is blighted by too many people, or if you have old buildings and narrow streets, you naturally discourage investment, because if there are no people or if there are very narrow streets that stop development, there is going to be very less investment, and if there is no investment into the city, it started breeding apathy and crime. So, when slowly the population category changes from wealthy to middle class, from middle class to lower middle class, and from lower middle class to slum areas, they contaminate the areas around them too. The solution that they proposed was to tear them down, to scatter the inhabitants, lay out super blocks, rebuild the area to an integrated plan. These were the proposals that were supposedly given by conventional city planners that had led to the decline of cities. So, then she takes influences of how these people had their ideas from. The city planning ideas were taken from great many individuals. So, she takes up 5 great people and the ideas of city planning that they had given. For example, she takes Ebenezer Howard's Garden City Plan, she takes Patrick Geddes' regional planning approach, Louis Mumford's Culture of Cities, Le Corbusier's Radiant City Plan, and finally Daniel Burnham's City Beautiful movement. She takes up all these 5 people's movements and then she talks and she tells us why that particular idea would not work in a modern city. So, the whole book is dealt with 4 different parts. Part 1 deals with the peculiar nature of cities. She talks about social behavior of people in cities, she talks about safety, and then she talks about use of sidewalks, contact in use of sidewalks, in assimilating the children, elderly people and people who need support in use of sidewalks. Then she talks about city neighborhoods, neighborhood parks and neighborhood areas. So, basically wherever the city meets with people, she talks about those areas in this particular unit. Under safety, she talks about how a city or a street can be safe from many purposes. Besides, the street has to be safe for primary reason, because the street is not just only to carry vehicles, and city sidewalks not just for people to move from one place to another. There are many other purposes beside carrying pedestrian and vehicular traffic. If the streets are safe from barbarism and other fear of vandalism or theft or robbery, or even other considerations like rape and mutilation, murder, etc., a city becomes well used and usable if the streets of the city are safe. She says there are 3 main qualities that are essential for a street. Firstly, there must be clear demarcation between what is a public space and what is a private space. So, there needs to be a place where you are clearly not entering onto somebody else's public space, and you are not entering onto somebody else's private space. There needs to be a clear demarcation, number 1. Second, she talks about a policy which is called eyes on the street. She says that eyes belonging to those who we might call as natural proprietors of the street, their eyes must face the street. For example, if there are a lot of people looking at a particular point in the street, obviously the crime is not going to happen there because there are people looking at it. In a busy neighborhood, nobody dares to make a crime there. So she calls for eyes on the street, buildings that need not orient on the inward or on the other side. The buildings must be oriented in such a way that there are always people on some windows or balconies or some porticos who are looking on the street. Number third, she talks about sidewalks, and it must be used fairly continuously. She says that the sidewalks must be used properly by the users. If the sidewalks are not being used by people, they slowly degenerate to form other kinds of para activities and even paralegal activities that deteriorates the image of the city. She talks about contact, and she talks about sidewalk life, the people who live in sidewalk, people who sit on the roadside cafes like this, people who sit on side benches, who can be called as self-appointed public characters, because if there is supposed to be some kind of a miscreant activity happening here, these people who are sitting on the other side of this cafe will be able to see it. They are these people who are in frequent contact with a wide circle of people. For example, these people who work on these cafes, this main qualification is that he is public and he talks to a lot of different people. That is the only qualification that they have. They could be people who are working on this store or people who manage the store, the manager of the store. They establish the identity for the entire street or entire neighborhood. Even if they just look out on the streets and they have so many people that they talk to on a regular basis, and they become self-appointed public characters of that particular street, and they become the life of that particular neighborhood. Everybody in the neighborhood will know him, and he will know each and every person. If not each and every person, he knows each and every locality in that neighborhood. Even if someone wants to ask for an address, they can ask that person. So he becomes the character of the neighborhood itself. Then she talks about children, how children in cities need a variety of places to play with, how the cities are not providing that right now, and they don't have lively sidewalks that children can play on, and they need unspecialized home base where they can play. So these are the certain things that Jane Jacobs talk about. Then she talks about neighborhood parks, and she says that the worst problem is parks are located precisely where people do not pass by. She says that when a person is moving from one place to another place, a park must be located on his way so that he can go to the park and spend some time there. If a park is located somewhere else, and if a person does not even pass through that park, how does he ever enter into the park? So the positioning of the park must be in such a way that it must be on transit axis where people pass by every day. She talks about three types of neighborhood. City as a whole is one neighborhood, street neighborhood, and district or sub-city. She talks about in different scale, and she talks about how the city neighborhoods can be developed by fostering lively and interesting streets, continuous traffic and continuous fabric of the city which has both pedestrian and vehicular traffic. She calls for using playgrounds and parks and other public areas and eateries and everywhere inside the fabric, and so that it should be on the way of when people move from one place to another. She talks about functional identity of certain areas and certain districts. The part 2 of this book, she talks about the conditions for city dwellers, the economic behavior of cities. She talks about the generators of diversity, the things that generate so much diversity in a city. A city cannot have one unified condition or category of people or occupations. A city just cannot survive with one major occupation. It needs to have a certain diversity. There needs to be a primary mixed use fabric in such a way that different types of people go and talk to different types of people. She calls for the need of smaller blocks in such a way that people have more of public areas and more usable spaces on the street, on the road. And she says that aged old buildings should be interspaced along with new buildings. That creates the character of the whole neighborhood. She talks about density, and she talks about density in diversity. She says that to understand city, one has to understand the combination or mixtures of uses. If the city is to be working, it needs to be sufficiently complex. The city should be sustainable, safety, public contacts and cross use. enormous diversity that is required of a city. These are certain ingredients that makes a diverse city. This diversity that is generated by city rests on the fact that in cities so many people are so close to each other. The density is so high, and just because the density is so high, the diversity goes up. The diversity goes up only when there are diverse activities and functions to perform. For diversity, Jane Jacobs calls for 4 different conditions. She says that the district must serve more than one primary function. If there is only one function in a particular district or a neighborhood, there will be only one class of people. Maybe there will be a few ups and downs here and there, but enormously there will be only one type of people, which will pull down the diversity that she is talking about. Then number 2, she talks about more blocks must be shot. She talks about in a particular area, if there is one big block, break it down into smaller blocks and put 4 smaller blocks in such a way that there are spaces in between the blocks which people can use as pedestrian ways, people can use as playgrounds, parks and other usable spaces for public. She also says that the district must vary in age and condition. There should be certain dilapidated buildings, there should be some very, very old buildings, there should be some buildings which have from different historic time periods. Then also finally, 4th point, she says that there must be sufficient density and diversity and different concentration of different kinds of people in the city. She takes example of 2 different scenarios here. The street bustles with activity because there are a mix of small shops, mix of mixed use apartments. There is an apartment, and on the ground floor of the apartment there is a shop, and there are mixed use activities over here. But in this place there is a dull homogeneous block of buildings here, and this is drawing constant ire from Jane Jacobs, and she states that this is dull and homogeneous and this is not a good way to do it. This is a much better way to do it according to her. Again, she says that long blocks, this is one really big block. Long blocks tend to attract only standardized store sizes, whereas short numerous little side streets and shortcuts are a staple of the village, West Village. If you see here, there are smaller roads that have a lot of shortcuts that leads to other blocks and smaller streets, and this attracts a very good variety of people, variety of buildings. And she says that if you have a long block, people don't like to walk across a long block. If the blocks are shorter, people find it easier and interesting to walk through short blocks. And then she again compares this new Bowery development that spans the whole block, one building in one block, ensuring that all living space will be hugely priced. Here there are multiple buildings in the same areas. For example, if this is a new construction, this could be of a higher rent, and if this is older construction, this could be cheaper buildings right on the next door of this new construction. This will attract a very wide variety of people. There will be rich people, there will be poor people, there will be people working elsewhere, there will be people owning multiple number of cars. Here it attracts only one kind of people. There is no diversity here, there is more of a homogeneity here, and the heterogeneity and the diversity in this place makes this space more interesting. Then she talks about the difference between a chaotic and dirty area, which is actually a better way to design it, because there are always people moving and there are people buying things. There is a good hustle and bustle in the activity zone here. Instead of providing a path which nobody ever uses and all the people are very busy in their own areas, where this particular area, even though it is designed well, it is not even being used, and it more likely to breed crime than this area. Even though that area looks bad, it has huge number of activity which makes it interesting and makes it less prone to crime. Even though the other building, which is designed properly, looks beautiful, and it is not working because there are hardly any people who go there. It creates a reason for people to behave bad and make crime. Then in the third part, she talks about the forces of decline and regeneration. She talks about self-destruction of diversity, the curse of border vacuum, the differences between unslumming and slumming. She talks about the cataclysmic money and the gradual money. In part 4, she talks about different tactics which she can use, her proposals where she can talk about different things like subsidizing the dwellings, erosion of cities, and attrition of automobiles. She talks about a visual order, limitation and possibilities of a visual order. She talks about salvaging older projects, governments and planning districts. So Jane Jacobs observes that the very conditions of mixed uses, dense populations, old buildings, and decentralized ownership create the opposite of slums, neighborhoods that regenerate themselves spontaneously, full of variety and diversity, attract large number of casual visitors and responsible new residents, encourages investment, revitalize the areas around them. So she takes example of these four properties, which is to create a mixed use, densify the population, use old and historic buildings and interface it along with the new buildings, and decentralize the ownership of the particular place. Using just these 4 points, she creates a wide positive variety or influence on a city. So now that we almost come to an end of this lecture, we will see what we learned during this lecture. We understood the writings of Jane Jacobs and Aldo Rossi. We understood architecture of the city by Aldo Rossi. We understood the death and life of great American cities by Jane Jacobs. We understood the city and its problems, architecture as a tool to solve social issues. With this in mind, we should be able to answer the following questions that are going to appear on your screen right now. Who was Aldo Rossi? Name any 2 books written by him. Who was Jane Jacobs? Name any 2 books written by her. Explain architecture and the city with sketches. Explain death and life of American cities with subtopics and detailed analysis. With this, we come to an end of this lecture. I look forward to meeting you with more interesting topics and lectures in the upcoming episodes. Until then, thank you.